Okay, the underside plane, of course, refers to the underside of the box. Remember, head's like a box. We have the bottom of the box. The underside is a deceptive and tricky series of planes, but at its most basic, it's essentially a shelf. The jaw kind of juts out of the neck like an open drawer or something. And the underside is responsible for that. The tricky thing about the underside that a lot of people miss is you can see it. Even like when you're looking at the head like this, you can see the underside. Only when you're looking at the head from a downward tilted angle can you not really see the underside. But even front on, you'll still catch a little glimpse of some of the underside. It becomes especially apparent when you're looking at the head from the side, because of course the jaw comes up, right? And when the jaw comes up, we're exposed to more of that underside. Also, the fact that this plane does have a bit of an angle to it means that it's going to be evident from many different perspectives. So we'll look at that. We'll look at it from a simple standpoint. We'll also look at how it wraps around the neck, these little plane changes in here. Very, very misunderstood plane of the head that is really of critical importance. So let's get to it. So the thing about the underside, like I mentioned, is it shows up often. Even in this seemingly neutral profile view, the underside of the head is apparent, this plane here. And right there is where a lot of people make a mistake. They'll forget about that underplane and they'll just kind of do this, like the jaw meets the neck in this kind of straight head sort of way. And while that kind of looks all right, it's really wrong. Like it flattens out the head quite a bit. This is one of the #1 design mistakes I see in paintings and drawings. That underplane just isn't there. Again, it's a deceptively sort of simple plane. It's kind of hidden in plain sight, no pun intended. Looking at the Asaro head, the thing both of these diagrams have in common is that we're looking slightly up at the head in both cases. Again, the handy line to follow is the zygomatic bone there. If it kind of points upward diagonally, that means you're looking up at the head. You can also map out the box, if this is like the corner of the box, you have this sort of action here happening, looking upwards at the box of the head. Same thing here. We're looking up at the head ever so slightly. And when you do that, you're bound to see this bottom plane. It's got a beautiful sort of triangular shape to it. And the main thing I'd like to remind you of is that the mandible is subcutaneous along its entire bottom edge. Remember, the mandible being this bone right here that wraps all the way around the skull, forming both sides of the jaw and the chin. This angle gives us our first glimpse at what this plane looks like, or what it's shaped like. If I just quickly traced this plane and just brought it over here, you can see it's kind of this triangular sort of shape. Now it's in perspective here, but in general it's this triangular / boxy hybrid that kind of maps out the underside of the head. This diagram gives us a pretty clear view of what that triangular plane looks like when it's more or less straight on. Well, there's still perspective here, but let's just take a look at this. Again, the subcutaneous parts of the skull, starting from the break in direction right here, follows the mandible, slight change of direction we looked at for the side of the chin, straight for the front of the chin, and again mirrored on this side. There's the subcutaneous part, and because of that, you can basically just draw a line through it to represent the overall plane change from the front and side part of the box to the underside of the box. And then I like to think of the underside as kind of like a shelf or a drawer. Like, think of pulling a drawer out of the chest, it comes out straight and you've kind of got this straight sort of plane. Now it's not perfectly straight. It recesses further back here and comes forward here. So, it's kind of this sort of action, ever so slightly tapered. And this generally lines up with the planes. If I just kind of mapped out that cheekbone / chin, front plane of the head, and then with the jaw being the side planes of the head, the underside, kind of lines up. Like this would be the side of the head, this is the other side of the head, and this is the front of the head. These planes all kind of match up. Going back to the Asaro head diagram, you can see why the plane is not just flat, why this point is deeper this way and this point is in the front. It's because our neck is not just a flat cylinder. Our neck has anatomy. There's the thyroid cartilage there and things like that. The neck is not really part of this lesson. I'm focusing on the head in this lesson, but in general, you can see on the Asaro head, we have some basic planes of the neck mapped out here. So of course, it stands to reason that the underside of the head has to follow the plane changes of the neck itself. So again, mostly it's triangular, but you do have this sort of perspective going on where this point is further back in space than that point. The nice thing about the underside plane is that whenever the light's coming from above, like it is in this diagram or this photo, the underside plane will be completely in shadow. So if we just trace that shadow shape, we're going to get a good look at it. And again, it comes forward here straight where the thyroid stuff is. And then here we have a cast shadow. We'll talk about, cast shadows and form shadows later, but that plane would wrap around, meeting the underside of the jaw, and we have this kind of thing. Even though the model is bearded here, we can still see, thanks to the shadow, that clear plane, that, again, triangular sort of plane, rounding out here, going all the way back, coming forward where the front of the neck is, and then going back to meet the break in direction of the skull, which, as we know, is right there. The camera is located underneath this guy's head, so we're seeing a lot of the underside of the head here. This brings up another important point. The width, the thickness of this plane is much greater here at the front, where it extends out to the chin, than it is here. In fact, the whole thing kind of tapers pretty gracefully. If you start at the midpoint of the chin, it's longest there, and then it just progresses shorter and shorter and shorter. Again, longest here where it goes to the chin, and then shorter and shorter and shorter, to the point where the underside plane ends, which is basically right where the jaw changes direction. This is where the underside begins. Now, it never really tapers to a hair-thin point. There is, even at its smallest point there is still thickness. If I were to do a bit of cross-contouring, tracing a line sort of down that rounded jaw like we talked about, when it meets the underside, it turns under. There is this, turning action, this thickness to how the jaw turns. It's not a razor-thin line. You can see that quite clearly in this diagram. That mandible bone has thickness to it as it turns. It's not like a piece of paper that, that goes from here to here. It goes like this, like that, and then in. There's a thickness here. So just be careful. Another error that you sometimes see is this thickness is not represented, and it's just kind of and it's sort of this unrealistic, overly box-like change. Yes, the head is like a box, but it's far from a perfect box. It doesn't have the perfectly sharp corners of a box. There's always this kind of thickness to where these planes change. Probably the closest we get to a really sharp edge is up here in the temple, which we talked about. That's a pretty fine change right there. But even that will have a little bit of thickness. Anyway, getting off topic. This diagram reinforces how handy that underside of the mandible is. It's all subcutaneous. We have that front of the chin going in this direction, side of the chin going in that direction, the jawline, a slight change in direction from that. Then, of course, it matches on the other side of the head. Be careful with perspective here. This is a plane that should be studied carefully so you can understand what perspective does in each different view. Again, that's your homework. But yeah, keep in mind where the thyroid cartilage is up here, basically this sort of boxy plane here. That underside plane will come forward to meet it, and then it tapers back to meet the change of direction in the jaw, but still has thickness even way back here. Then it has the most thickness up here. I should point out that on a heavier set model, that plane does get disguised under sort of hanging flesh. Gravity takes its toll, and because there's nothing for the skin to attach to, there's this sagging action here. And this will even mask the subcutaneous parts here of the mandible. Now, it's still subcutaneous, but because flesh is hanging right down from it, it appears to be this continuous line. However, the mental protuberance of the chin usually still will jut out, and the person's chin will still be obvious. This person is neither thin nor overly thick. Also, he's older, so you have some of this, natural effects of sagging skin that happens to all of us. But that subcutaneous mandible is still there. And, this is in shadow, it's a little hard to see it, but especially in the light, we can trace the subcutaneous mandible underside there. And because this camera is below the eye line, as I'm tracing, thanks to the zygomatic bone there, let me just trace the cheekbones down to the front of the chin, this side as well, being careful to observe the knowledge we've gained already. Down here to the bottom of the mandible where it meets the front plane of the chin. And then we have this kind of shelving action coming up front to meet the thyroid area and then ducking back a little bit in space. Again, this is foreshortened, so it's, it's only a little bit. We're seeing this from the front view. And coming back to meet that change in direction of the mandible right there. And of course, the same thing happens on the other side of the head. So we have this subtle, yet still noticeable underplane of the head. Again, it's very common to miss this plane because you don't always expect to see it. We tend to think that, it's the underside of the head, therefore you don't see it, but it's very common to see this plane. And what's tough about this plane is unless you're looking directly underneath the person's head, which you almost never are, it's almost always foreshortened. So this is that deceptively simple plane that is very worth your time to understand and study. So just to do a few drawings here, maybe the first thing we can try is getting that underside of the mandible, which we know subcutaneous. It's this triangular shape, pretty easy to draw. some basic perspective lines in. We know the jaw is a side plane. We know this is the front plane of the head. Other jaw is also a side plane. This will allow us to kind of block in our cheekbone rhythm. Going down to the front of the chin, this would be that kind of, this would be that sad face rhythm right in here. We know these planes meet the thyroid / front of the neck area. And then it's in perspective, so it's a bit foreshortened, but this does go back a little bit and then meets the mandible right where that change of direction occurs. And the mandible will go up like this. We're looking at such a localized section of the head here, so it does help to throw in some values. Let's map in the side planes first with the value like this. And then with an even darker value, we'll get that underplane, the underside of the head. Again, this plane is usually in shadow because usually the light's coming from above. We can even get the side plane of the chin here if we wanted to. Always helpful to do some cross contouring. Just go down the jaw, get that thickness there, and then in. Again, down this side of the jaw, thickness there, and in. And this is a solid piece of geometry that is a good understanding of how the planes of the head are working. If we wanted to gesture down the front plane of the neck, we could, just to continue that down. We'll talk about the actual neck connection to the box of the head later on. Let's try a lower 3/4 view. I'll just block in some basic perspective here. Again, it's always helpful to get the front plane of the chin moving into the side plane of the jaw because it's subcutaneous, it's always going to be there. We'll get that angle of the jaw here where it breaks, changes in direction. If we want, we can kind of map out that front plane of the head meeting the cheekbones. We know these two planes point up to different degrees. We can even kind of map out the chin itself here if we want. Let's trace the mandible around to the other side of the head. Let's get that front of the neck right in here. Let's get a quick center line. It's a very foreshortened head, so the center line will come down like this. We'll get that front plane of the neck, maybe a little bit further back than that, maybe over here. And then trace this plane up, foreshortened on the other side, and the neck comes down. Give this plane a bit of a value. And then deal with the back of the head, which we haven't talked about yet, but the neck will connect somewhere in there. If this plane feels too small, you can always just edit it, right? Feel like it needs to be more of a shelf, especially in this perspective, where we're seeing more of that underside. Just do the requisite cross contouring to make sure I get that full sense of form in there. How about even more of a profile view? This is the front of the face. The chin represented here. I'm not going to draw the chin, I'll just draw that lower point. I kind of landmark where it's always nice to landmark sometimes. Let's get that angle of the jaw turning up, again respecting that angle. We'll wrap this plane right around like we did here, but this is more of a profile, so it's going to be a tighter bit of foreshortening. And then that neck is going to come in down here. The head is very wide from the profile, so the neck connects way back there. We'll talk about that later. Right now what's important is to get this shelving action of this plane. Always handy if you want to map out where that jaw would be and where it separates from the zygomatic and the front planes of the cheek. Throw a little bit of tone on here just for emphasis. A little bit darker at the bottom because it's turning way under as it's turning more aggressively underneath. And we'll even throw in a little cast shadow in this one. I'll talk about that stuff later though. Just for fun, we can even build on this, getting the change of the brow, the overall direction of the head. We know the chin comes out a little bit more. Constructing the head can be fun, piece by piece. Let's try another profile view, but one that's less aggressively pointed up, so more of a neutral profile. This time let's build in that chin, just so we can see what we're doing here. This time we're getting more of this neutral profile where the camera's kind of looking more or less directly at the jaw. But even in this view, we will see this underplane come through a little bit as that chin turns under right there, this underplane. Although it doesn't go back that far, it goes here. Again, meeting that front plane of the neck and down. We can draw our center lines. We're just slightly looking up at the head, but it's more of a neutral view. In fact, I should mirror this so we can compare this drawing to our previous one. We've raised the camera just a little bit and we're seeing less of that underside of the plane. This is how you can deal with, subtle perspectives. And we can trace the jaw there, side plane. And just to make this one a little different, what we can do is simulate more of a heavy model by getting rid of these lines. Well, keep them ghosted so we can see them. But based on what we learned earlier, we know the chin will remain pretty obvious. The flesh kind of drapes from this point. and it comes down. If it's a saggy, sort of fleshy effect, it'll come down here, and instantly we get a heavier looking model. Of course, this neck will be also softened. It'll just soften itself right into the neck. And we probably won't get much information, plane change information here. This will be more or less a smooth kind of line. And when this happens, the sagging skin forms its own plane changes, and we get this sort of thing. All right, that should do it for the underside. Let's move on now to the features of the face.